Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Then and Now, sponsored by the Luskin Center for History and Policy at UCLA. I am Eddie Cole, an associate professor in education and history at UCLA and a senior fellow for the Luskin Center for History and Policy, which has the goal of bringing history into conversation with the present. In short, the center's mission is centered around how lessons from the past can better position us to think about contemporary policies and practices to chart a course toward a brighter future. As we start 2022, it is common for people to pause and reflect on where things stand, both personally and professionally. In assessing ourselves in society, we find ourselves entering a third year of the global coronavirus pandemic, an uptick in natural disasters, a world notably in places like Los Angeles, where the cost of living outpaces what millions of residents can afford. In one word, crises captures so many of the problems facing us today. And one example, or an ecosystem, if you will, that captures so many of these dueling challenges is the U.S. higher education system and its thousands of colleges and universities. Crises on campus today includes tuition increases that continue to go up, the battle over critical race theory, and the thought of debating race on campus, the upcoming Supreme Court case regarding the use of affirmative action within U.S. higher education, attacks on academic freedom and questions over free speech, and the return to in-person instruction while the pandemic continues. Today, we have special guests on Then and Now, three outstanding scholars who have worked on a new Luskin Center report on the university and crises. We have with us today Jazz Kiang, Nayiri Artounians, and Jannelle Dang. The three of you, welcome. Hello, how are you doing?
Great. Thanks, Eddie, for having us.
Sure thing. First, tell us a little bit about yourself and why a study of crises has captured your attention. We'll start with you, Jazz.
Great. Well, as introduced, I'm Jazz. I'm a current PhD student in UCLA's Higher Education and Organizational Change program. But I've also been at UCLA for about the last 10 years. I did my undergrad here as well. And I guess even my whole story to grad school was linking my own student activism and service at the university to wanting to study about those ecosystems that I've participated in. And so I think teeing up this project about how a university deals with crisis, deals with very challenging moments, it's a great opportunity. And I'm more than happy to be joined by two undergraduate researchers on this team who are phenomenal in their own right, Nayiri and Jannelle. So I'll pass it to Nayiri.
Hi, thanks, Jazz. My name is Nayiri. I am an undergrad student at UCLA. I'm a third year studying history and minoring in art history and education. I guess I wanted to look at crisis because of my own experience here. I came in as a freshman and that was just kind of taken away from me, but not even just the broader educational aspect of it. I got involved in a few orgs in my time when I was a freshman, my main organization being UCLA Radio. And because being in radio required so much of an in-station, on-campus presence, that was kind of a crisis for us because we couldn't do the one thing that we're supposed to do as an organization, which is broadcasting live from our station in Ackerman Union. And so, dealing with that sort of crisis in our own club, it was interesting to me to also see how crisis has been dealt with on an institutional level, because, the institutional level interacts so much with these organizations and it hits us at a personal level. So I was interested based on that. And I guess I'll pass it along to Jannelle.
Thanks, Nayiri. Hi, everyone. My name is Jannelle. I am a fourth year student studying cognitive science and minoring in education. The crisis topic appealed to me because, first of all, I saw the application for this opportunity come out during COVID, so I thought it was very relevant to the COVID crisis. And also, for me and like peers that I interact with, we feel most of the time that the inner workings of the university are really like hidden. And I wanted to do more research into that to kind of demystify that, because as students, it's really strange to feel so removed from the rest of your campus and how it works, especially during such a critical time. I thought it would be interesting to get to know more about how the institution navigates these moments.
Excellent. So great to hear from the three of you. And just to give us a little flavor of what brought you to this project, I have to ask now, as you think about listeners near and far, what would you say to them with regard to this new report on the history of crises? What would you say it reveals? Or better said, how do you see the study of the past been insightful to what we think we know about the past? Nayiri, I'll start with you on that one.
I think one of the major things that I kind of took away from my portion of the project, and which I'll give a little context on. So my portion of the project was looking specifically at how the ethnic study centers were formulated and created at UCLA and the processes that were undertaken to make those a reality. And so I would say that one thing that I learned was that in a moment of crisis, we tend to revert back to what we know. We use what's already ingrained and used. We use those traditional structures that we already have in order to kind of map things out for ourselves. And so in relation to, let's say, the Ethnic Studies Center, they were very heavily modeled, even though they were very like revolutionary new concept in line with the social context of the time. They were heavily modeled off of existing structures that already existed within UCLA's system, specifically the Organized Research Unit, also known as an ORU.
Nice, very insightful. Jazz, you wanna chime in on this one?
Yeah, maybe to backtrack just a little bit. When this project first started, which was in the summer of 2020, part of it was the recognition that universities don't exist in vacuums. And I think, Eddie, you teed that up very well in connecting sort of all the happenings around us, what's going on in the world. Universities are kind of staging grounds for these issues to play out. And I think it raised questions for us as a research team. How do we look at the phenomenon of crisis when crisis itself can manifest in so many different ways? The difference between, say, an institution with a flooding disaster is a crisis, but that's very different from, say, an institution dealing with a loyalty oath. And these are things that have happened over time, over the course of history, that have affected universities, particularly a place like the University of California. And so I think the entry point was, let's look at examples of these very challenging moments of the past and see how UCLA as an institution kind of navigated that. And I think from there, we can then have a better idea of crisis as a phenomenon. What are some takeaways from that we can apply to the present?
That's so insightful. And you're right. I mean, the connections between what we see at the university level in terms of crises and what we see in the world have always been interconnected. And I think that's important for us to remember, is that, again, the university does not sit within this sort of ivory tower bubble, if you will, right? These so many things that happen in the world are shaping the institution. And in many ways, our institutions are shaping the world. With that said, Jannelle, let me ask you a question. What would you say are some of the most salient, need to know things from each of the crisis moments covered within a report, or even specifically to the section that you worked on? What would you say to a listener? What's most important to know?
Sure. Okay. So starting with an overview of all the crises that we talked about in the report, from the Campbell Hall killings to the ethnic study centers and the firing of Angela Davis, we found that, like Nayiri mentioned, during times of crisis, universities do revert back to things that they've always done. History does repeat itself, but Also, like Jazz mentioned, it depends on the crisis, it depends on the context. It manifests in different ways, but I think the strategies and the motives are pretty similar. My section in particular was the Campbell Hall and High Potential Program category. And one of the key takeaways from that section, I think, was when we go back and look at history, we find that there are like certain stories and ideas that we've always been telling ourselves that may not actually be accurate when you go back and look at what really happened. You find different interpretations and you find areas where maybe we made assumptions that may not necessarily be true. And it's important to do that to prevent false histories from being told or misinterpreted histories from being told. For example, for the HPP or High Potential Program and the deaths of Carter and Huggins at Campbell Hall, a lot of the times those events are linked together where people will say, because there was violence involving Carter and Huggins at Campbell Hall and they were HPP students, it kind of led to the demise of the HPP. Like the university thought that that was a bad look for them, so they wanted to cut the program. That's a common connection that's made. However, when we went back and looked at the archival documents and did our research, we found that that wasn't necessarily a causal event, and the trajectory of the HPP was kind of going in a direction where it was going to change and it was going to kind of end in the way that it was and become something else anyways, regardless of the Campbell Hall events. So that's an example of a takeaway where history wasn't what we've always been telling ourselves.
That's really insightful. It really speaks to the importance of a report like this, because the one thing about crises is that it certainly resonates within the memories of so many people, but it resonates differently from different parts of campus to different role that people have played on campus, or simply how the urban legend is told oftentimes. So this is really insightful about this report. Jazz, let me ask you, for the listener out there who hasn't had a chance to look at this new report just yet, what kind of overview would you give them? Jannelle just started us off very nicely on what they can expect to read in the report. But what kind of overview could you give someone who casually hasn't had a chance to read it just yet, and what they can expect to see about UCLA, but also how it speaks to the larger U.S. higher education system?
Yeah, terrific question, Eddie. I think the first thing to point out is this report is hopefully the start of many more case studies on crisis moments in American higher education that this center will focus on. This report only focused really on 3 moments specifically at UCLA. And we honed in on a very specific 3-year period, 1968 through 1971. And there are a couple of reasons for this. I'll talk about that in a second. But I want to just make that clear because there's so much when it comes to case study work that you have to kind of, as researchers, choose what to focus on. And I think the first thing we had to come to terms with was, well, this whole phenomenon of crisis is so large that already we have to be very particular about what we're identifying. So hopefully, this is the first of many reports. I think that's one goal. But to hone in on that 3-year period of 1968 through 1971, this is very interesting to us because it comes in a time period, of course, of what we historicize as social movements period, a whole transformation, expansion of American higher education. This idea that public universities are much more accessible, particularly to minoritized populations. So a lot of changes are happening both in society that are playing out in the college university staging ground. And particularly at the University of California and at UCLA, it intersects with a very interesting time of university history, which is first and foremost having a new chancellor at UCLA and the youngest individual to ever take on this role, Charles E. Young. And so his administration starts in 1968, and particularly during a time when these moments are now starting to play out. And so we, as a research team, we decided to hone in on this connection because it's almost like a circumstance of change in the issues, but also circumstance of change in the administration. And so we kind of really want to look at, well, these are some pivotal moments early on of a new chancellor, a new administration, perhaps seen as an opportunity for change. And so how did that play out? And you'll see that in the report of us sort of honing in on this. And perhaps, we could talk a little bit more about how the salience of Chancellor Young as a first-time young chancellor plays out.
Insightful. Thank you for that, Jazz. You hit on something that really, caught my ear and hopefully captures listeners' ears as well, is that talking about this sort of shift at UCLA, but shift in general in higher education is often referred to as the social movements era or sort of peak social movement era. But, there's so much going on in higher education at that point. How do you make sense of it all, right? And that leads me to ask you all the next question, particularly as it pertains to the research that went into it from an archival standpoint. Nayiri, I want to ask you first, how did you go about capturing the narrative in your research that we see in this report? And what was your process for combing through the data? So the archival documents, interviews, secondary sources. How did you all make sense of it all? Because Jazz just gave us a great overview of so much that's in the report, building on what Jannelle said right before Jazz. So Nayiri, help us make sense of the research behind it.
So I think as Jazz and Jannelle both touched on, sometimes the history that's presented to us within either these, just the perceptions we have, it's not always like the true representative of it. And I feel like that was kind of an issue, like a problem that we had to tackle, or at least that I did in my section of the research, because most of the documents that we were going through were taken from UCLA Library Special Collections archives. Specifically, well, at least my section was very much taken from files of like Chancellor Murphy and Chancellor Young. And so these are official transmissions and letters and official things that are edited and copy edited that we're seeing when we analyze things. And so that was interesting to me, because to me the question was, how are they framing the crisis in these more filtered sources, correct? So it was interesting for me, at least, to take these documents, which give the official processes, for example, the approval of the centers, the implementation, the correspondence going on between the officials, and comparing that to the student perspectives that were written in completely different mediums, right? Through student newspapers, through student newspapers and interviews of the time. And so it was really about putting those pieces together. And the way I did that personally was, when I was going through these documents and these archives, I wouldn't really take note of specifically what was said in those documents. More, I would look at specific themes that I would notice within each one, and very broad themes like community or funding or support and things like that, because we also don't have every single document that was being passed back and forth during that time. And so kind of putting documents in this thematic categories for myself really helped me try to see the narratives, especially for my section when I was looking at 4 different centers and the inception of 4 different centers. And so that thematic approach worked for me because it was about weaving them all together into one process, getting all these different stories and trying to weave them together into one historical narrative here. And so taking those past documents and corroborating them sort of with student interviews from the UCLA Oral History Center, and also interviews that Jazz and the earlier research team had done with Chuck Young and Carlos Harrow and all those people. It was about me trying to connect the dots together in that way.
Thank you, Nayiri. That's a lot of work went into it, it sounds. For sure. You mentioned something in your response that I actually want to come back to Jazz first, and then I got another question for Jannelle after that. But Jazz, you mentioned, this being a certain time for Chancellor Charles E. Young, starting his chancellorship in 1968. And I think it's important also, since Nayiri just mentioned, looking at the formal records, particularly Chancellor's records, Chancellor Franklin Murphy before Chancellor Young, Earlier you mentioned that you had a little bit more that you want to add as it pertains to a new chancellor taking over during this period. How does that also matter to all of this as we think about crises and leadership on campus?
Yeah, and I think Nairi kind of positioned it well in terms of first, I got to give a shout out to the earlier iterations of this research team. So there's the three of us, Eddie, that you're talking to today. But there were other student researchers who were part of earlier angles on this project, as well as those of us who were doing the work in the archives. And even during a time of COVID, getting access to the archival documents was a challenge. But I think to your point, Eddie, it's so important for, I think, institutions to protect and caretake administrative documents, whether it be through a formal university archive or something akin to that, because a lot of this stuff, is firsthand, as Nairi said, the communications between folks. And particularly during a time at UCLA, 1968, when there was a transition in the senior executive leadership, you see that play out even in the documents themselves. We also have to note that, archives aren't objective. There's, of course, a lot of inner layers of what ends up getting protected and caretaken over the years. That has its own, from a research methodological standpoint, there are issues to parse out there. But we wouldn't be successful in this project at all, I think, if we didn't have access to the hundreds of archival documents that we ended up looking at. And I say that because, of course, we were fortunate in speaking with folks, but the whole entire point of triangulating what folks are saying in their interviews with the administrative documents was where we were able to truly capture, okay, what happened here? And I think for particularly the angle of Chancellor Young and our conversations with him, it really showcased how he was very involved as a chancellor, and maybe to the degree that many chancellors or university presidents today are not involved in decision making. And probably he himself, as part of his legacy, he would explain that as part of something that he cared about. And I remember in one of our interviews with him, he made a reference, a very funny reference to Hamilton, and he basically said, in reference to, I believe, the negotiations for the ethnic studies centers, that he wanted to be in the room where it happened. And for every decision-making moment that involved resources or a true transformation of something, he had to be in the room. And I think that's very unique because, one, it speaks to the legitimacy that he had as a young chancellor, no pun intended with his name. But at the same time, it speaks to maybe perhaps a change in how leadership decisions are made. If we charted out the course of the last 50 years of American higher education, we probably would see a trend too of university leaders not having as much of a hands-on involvement that Chancellor Young did. And so I think that was a very pivotal aspect of this report in terms of his involvement in all of the crisis moments that we looked at.
Thank you for that, Jazz. It's really fascinating work here, and you really did a fascinating and good job of contextualizing the role of the administrator. And for the listeners who don't have much context about the history of UCLA administrators, Chancellor Young, if I'm not mistaken, actually started his chancellorship in his late 30s. So you get a little context of what it means to be a young chancellor at the end of the 1960s, going into the 1970s. Okay, so much going on in the world, and to also be that young of a senior leader administrator serving as chancellor of the University of California, Los Angeles. But with that said, much of our conversation about history thus far has leaned heavily on references to administrators, using administrative records, which are always insightful, even triangulating your interviews with some of those senior leaders in connection to what their archival records leave behind. But that leads me to ask another question. And you even used the word protect, Jazz. I got to ask this question about Jannelle. Perhaps you can give us some insight on this. How was crises handled, or better yet, whose voices were notably left out, right? So when you think about this report, when you think about sort of the broader overview of crises in the university, we've had a lot of conversation about administrators, but what does it mean in terms of thinking about whose voices were omitted?
Sure. To answer this question, I'm going to focus more on my specific focus in the report, which was the high potential program and the Campbell Hall events. This is a very relevant issue for those two events, because Young's background as a young chancellor, as well as just the political and social climate around that time in the late 1960s, put a lot of pressure on him to make sure that the deaths of Bunchy Carter and John Huggins were not going to become incentive for people to have negative images about UCLA as an uncontrolled campus and an unqualified chancellor who can't control how students and faculty and the surrounding community are reacting to acts of violence. So it was really important for the institutional response to be very calm, very organized, and to essentially make it seem like everything was going to be fine and it was under control. This also applies to concerns about the HPP. Once people heard that that program might be cut or defunded, they were very concerned, and people reached out to Young, such as the California senator and the president of a local Democratic club. They were asking him, like, hey, what's going on with that? And there were a lot of concerns about that. So to kind of quell those fears amongst the public, it was very important for Young to put forward a front that the university was figuring it out and they were definitely having conversations with relevant stakeholders. But that being said, to answer your question about whose voices were left out, I found that in comparing the archival documents that were brochures and reports put out by the university to the public, compared to meeting notes that were taken by actual students in the high potential program, there was a disconnect in that what students were expressing was not included in those public reports. Students were expressing that the HPP as it was and proposals for the new program that was succeeded were not the same in nature. They didn't have the same goals, and they weren't including the voices of students and what they wanted to see for the future program. But in reports that were given to the public, the narrative was basically like, don't worry, the HPP as it was is still going to exist, and we still have a very strong commitment to our ethnic minority communities. But given that they didn't really include their voices in those conversations, it called into question how deep that commitment was.
Thank you for that, Jannelle. That is so interesting to me to hear you succinctly make the connection between what we know, but also whose voices have been omitted and how that was even framed historically during that moment. To stay true to the title of this podcast and also where we want to go with this conversation, we've talked a lot about the then. We've got deep into the history that's covered in this new report. But I also want to sort of push us to transition our thoughts to the now. I think if you're just sort of casually going through your collection of your favorite podcasts to listen to, and you see the title of this episode, the University in Crisis could very much be about 2022. Okay. And Jannelle just used a phrase that I hope everybody caught: acts of violence. That was used in reference to something at UCLA in the past, but it's not lost on me that just within the first month of 2022, there have been concerns around acts of violence on college campuses across the United States. Notably, many historically Black colleges and universities have received bomb threats within the past few weeks. As I mentioned at the top of the show, there's the question of affirmative action. So got to come back to Jannelle's point also about UCLA's high potential program during the late 60s and early 70s, which was a program, an intentional effort to recruit more students of color to the UCLA. But also the report that you all hopefully will make some time to check out also grapples with the legacy of Professor Angela Davis and the question of academic freedom at UCLA. And again, it's not lost on me that in some states right now, There are political interference at the state level over what faculty can even weigh in on from their expertise. And so all of these issues that are so relevant and at the heart of this new report also sit with us today in real time. I want to first come to you, Jazz, on this one, and I'd love to hear from all three of you, but have you learned anything interesting about the university that otherwise you would not have known, especially as you reflect on things today?
What a terrific question. And, in sync with, I think, the theme and of all these podcast sessions that the center has done. Eddie, you already listed a few examples of crises in the now affecting American higher education institutions. We made direct parallels with the three crisis moments that we identified between 1968 to 1971 with today. Nayiri's focus on the creation of the ethnic studies centers at UCLA and really the whole demand for ethnic studies in the first place in curriculum during that time, that has a original story with what we see as the current attacks on critical race theory being taught in schools, that being a very 2020, 2021, 2022 kind of thing. But that actually was empowered because of attacks on ethnic studies in the 2010s. We saw that in Arizona particularly play out with the Mexican American studies curriculum. And so looking almost at the original story of how ethnic studies came to be, especially on college campuses in 1968, like there's a direct parallel there with the discourse on sort of culturally relevant curriculum today in schools and teaching, all of that. That's one direct parallel that we see, just at least in that discourse. And even though it's framed a lot around critical race theory itself, it actually is very related to the attacks on ethnic studies more broadly. The second moment, which Jannelle looked at, which is on the high potential programs, transformations, and the killings of Bunchy Carter and John Huggins on campus at UCLA, that ties with a couple issues. The first one, of course, being violence and shootings in schools, on college campuses. Even at UCLA, we had a threat of a potential shooting on campus. And so that was very, very real time for us. But more perhaps in another way, the connection with, say, high potential program as this avenue for recruiting and perhaps enrolling more folks of color in colleges and universities. We have a whole discourse right now with regard to admissions, the Supreme Court cases on affirmative action, but also when schools started tossing standardized exam scores in admissions because there's a new sort of realization that perhaps they don't measure the true quote unquote potential of young people, and there may be perhaps more equitable ways to doing so. That's another parallel, I think, with one of the crisis moments that we looked at from back then. And then lastly, our focus on the Angela Davis case. It's almost haunting that at the University of North Carolina, the whole tenure debacle for Nicole Hannah-Jones, and ultimately Howard University saw it as a tremendous opportunity to leverage that moment. And so we're seeing all these things play out. But I think, Eddie, as you said it, the connection between then and now is scarily connected.
Well said, Jazz. Well said, Jazz. Nayiri, you want to add in more on this one? How are you seeing the then and now?
For me personally, I'm kind of relating it to my experience right now as an undergrad. And I think particularly of UCLA, a lot of, my peers have always had this complaint that, UCLA never tells us what's going on. Like we never know what's happening, especially with this past winter quarter with going remote and then suddenly, are we going in person? And then the whole thing that's happened with Disabled Students Union to DSU with the protest to be hybrid. So for me, the connection between then and now is how this aspect of who is making these decisions, this aspect of shared governance. I learned a lot about the academic senate through my part of the research and what their relationships are with the chancellor, like as in kind of like an executive board type situation, right? And then with the student government and with the general student population. So the connection for me for then and now is how these decision-making bodies, there's still this sense of, students personally feel the sense that there needs to be more transparency. And so that is something that I took away.
Yeah, a transparency, a theme that seems to span 6 decades for us when you reflect on this report and where we stand today. Jannelle, what do you think? The then and now, how did, working on this report for so long, when you look at it, it's new, it's out, everybody can check it out. What would you say stands out to you?
Similar to what Nayiri said, I'm an undergrad too, and I'm on my way out. So I'm glad that I got this opportunity to actually get some insight to how the university's flow of decision making works. It's been 4 years, and this whole time, like, I've been in the same boat where I don't know what's happening. And we do feel that there's a lack of transparency. But something I learned from this report that I wouldn't have known otherwise is that it's hard for university leaders to satisfy all these stakeholders' voices. As much as they may want to prioritize listening to students and faculty and outside community members, they do also have to balance that with other constraints like time and especially finances. And it's not great to have to prioritize those things and kind of sacrifice the voices of the community as a result. But it is very real. And that's just how universities have to work. I found that out, that like, as much as students may want and push for our voices to be heard more, we have to realize that there's a very constrained frame that we have to make our requests within in order for them to be realistic and to even gain leverage in conversations that we have with administrative leaders.
Oh, wow. I really appreciate you saying that. And I think when you think about the university in crises, I don't think a lot of people would envy the historic role or the contemporary role of the senior academic leader, because so many people are making demands of them and from so many different directions. But you all are, experts in a lot of ways on this history of crisis in the university. Since you spent, this report has been a couple years in the making. With that said, sort of as we think about the now, based on what you know about history, and especially based on what Jannelle just told us about student power and crises and students wanting more transparency, what would you all advise of university leaders today who probably haven't had the chance to do the deep archival work and conduct the interviews with past leaders that you all have done? Based on what this report tells you and based on the research that you've done, if you had a chance to talk to a chancellor or a college president or some other senior level administrator, what advice would you give them? Jazz?
Yeah, I think the way Jannelle was positioning part of her own takeaways is kind of how I'll answer this question. There's one word that captures the notion that I think of, and that's partnership. And partnership really involves a lot of different elements, but trust, resources, a lot of these things, but partnership in the sense that folks at the table take each other seriously and take each other's ideas with the notion of respect, without outsized ideas that are unrealistic. I think that element is very necessary, both from the administrative leadership of a university, but also from other leaders. Eddie, you asked the question of what would we advise university leaders. When I think of a university leader, it's not just those who are in an administrative role. I think even for student leaders, the notion of seeing their advocacy in the form of partnership is very important. And what we learned from doing the research on our report, something like, say, the establishment of the ethnic studies centers at UCLA, that was, I think, a strategic understanding of partnership. And even though folks might have started at different sides of the table with differing visions of what it would look like, it was a strategic kind of conversation that understood, okay, what are the constraints that we have here? And let's put the best pathway forward. And I think that is a notion that is inherently tied to if folks, parties in the room, respect the idea of partnership. Because at the end of the day, a lot of these things will either do not come to fruition during our own lifetimes at an institution, or they will last many years after we're gone. Either way, though, without partnership, none of it would happen.
A partnership, I really appreciate you elevating that point because something I think about in my own work is university partnerships, but also how do universities and different entities see other entities as equal partners within the educational enterprise, which is different from just being a partner, right? But how do you see this as sort of a shared effort among many entities? So that's really great that you shared that with us. That leads me to ask my final question as we think about the then and now. I'll start with you, Nayiri. What does history teach us?
I think what I have learned and what history teaches us is that even though events in their direct, exact context and circumstances won't necessarily repeat themselves again, there are parallels and there are patterns that do repeat. And what I have taken away from this research, and especially in connection to everything that's going on right now at UCLA with COVID and all that, is that we need to look at those past contexts and try to find those parallels and try to find solutions through those parallels.
Mm-hmm. Jannelle.
I think, and this may sound quite general and like obvious or given even, that history teaches us that we have to create new things. Like, it's one thing to note that history repeats itself and these things happen over and over, but it's another to actually take that information and knowledge to create something that's better, something that's more relevant to the present. Like Jazz said, like these kinds of partnerships between students, administration, and faculty, there has to be some momentum in making those more intentional about how they're operating within certain limits and who they're including. Because we know these things, right? Like, based on history, we know how these things usually go. So that should be incentive to make them different and to make them better. And it really challenges the university to not fall back on old structures. Like, that was a very important finding from our report, that we revert to these old ways of decision making and these hierarchies, but when they're no longer relevant and we've seen that they don't really work as well as we think they do, then there's a very strong expressed need to take what we know and to create something new.
Excellent. So insightful. Thank you, Nayiri and Jannelle. Jazz, if, sort of the big wrap-up comment, what does history teach us?
I think in the context, particularly with this project, history teaches us that institutions outlast people. That's just a fact by very definition of what an institution is. But with that understanding, it's the people who build an institution that help shape its trajectory, its values, its priorities. And so that's why, while institutions outlast generations, I think the generations of people that help build that institution are the most important to learn from. And so as particularly younger folks doing this research or being activists ourselves, I think it's so critical then to learn from our elders, folks who have been in a part of these institutions, who have navigated and led these institutions. One, because their stories, they have to get captured or else we lose them. But two, I think the lessons that we learn from them help us, as Jannelle and Nayiri put together, hopefully lead the priorities to what's relevant for the future. And I'm kind of brought back to a UCLA leader former student leader, but just major humanitarian, one of the greatest Bruins of all time, Rayford Johnson. Rayford Johnson unfortunately passed away relatively recently. But during his celebration of life event on campus, which was in October, I remember one theme that I was asked to share was this idea of give time to this place to help this place address the needs of its time. And I think that's what people of an institution have the potential to do when they learn from history.
Absolutely stunning. Absolutely stunning. And what a perfect way to wrap up this conversation on then and now, as we think about how the past truly does give us insight for the future and hopefully pushes us to chart a better course in the future. Thank you, everyone, for listening to Then and Now, sponsored by the Luskin Center for History and Policy at UCLA. You've just heard from 3 stellar scholars who have worked on a new report released by the Center on the University in Crises: Jazz Kiang, Nayiri Artounians, and Jannelle Dang. I'm Eddie Cole, an associate professor in education and history at UCLA and a senior fellow for the Luskin Center, which again has the goal of bringing history into conversation with the present.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Maya Ferdman, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.